Hello student, welcome to Manifested e-learning platform. My name is Wilson Andove and I'm your literature teacher. We are discussing written literature. And I said before you begin reading the said books, you must understand some basic terminologies which are used in written literature, essentially the said books. And that's why for the last two lessons, we have been discussing literary terms. And today, it will be a continuation of the previous lesson. So this is written literature. And the topic is literary terms. As I've said before, literary terms just means the specific terminologies or words which are used in written literature. You should be able to understand these words for you to appreciate the said books that you are going to read. Now, in the previous lesson, we discussed an important concept called characters and characterization. For you, student, you must understand who a character is. And we said a character is anybody, any person, or even an animal that has a role in a piece of literature. We talked about the types of characters like a protagonist, an antagonist, a villain, minor character, and major characters. Now today, we want to pick up from there and talk about conflict. For a story to move forward, you must have a disagreement or a conflict. As long as you have two people living together, even in a family setup or at place of work, where two people are, there's always a disagreement. We call that a conflict. Conflict. So, in a story, for it to move forward, we must have a disagreement. That means views which are opposing. So, we call that a conflict. We can define this as a disagreement between characters in terms of differing viewpoints on a particular issue. So when characters have different viewpoints, we call that a conflict. Now, there are types of conflicts. So we have types of conflicts. We have 4 types of conflicts. The first one is person against person. Against person. This means two characters disagreeing. So we have two characters. Can it be more? Two characters disagreeing on a matter. That is called person against person. As long as two characters or even more characters do not agree on an issue, that's called person against person. Number 2, person against self. Person against self. Now it sounds a bit contradictory. Against self. Actually in this case it means as a character you have many opinions that are disturbing you. For example, you want to make a choice, but you have 2 options in life. You have 2 options. Then making that choice becomes a problem. Should you go with option A or option B? That's a conflict, a person against self. It means different thoughts. Different thoughts and choosing the right decision comes a challenge. It's like a dilemma. Let me give a very good example. This person who is very honest in his work, and now his boss tells him to do something that is unprofessional, that is unethical. Now this person who is honest, who is ethical, who is straightforward, may decide not to do, actually has two options. May decide not to do what has been told by his boss. That's the first option. He will stick to his principles. But if he does that, there's a likelihood that he might face some negative consequences. He might even lose his job. The boss might reprimand him, might punish him for failing to respect maybe his orders. So in such a case, this person has two voices in his mind. One tells him what your boss has told you to do is unethical, is wrong. But the other tells him, if you don't do it, you might end up losing your job. Now, that is a conflict within you. Person against self. So this is a conflict. Conflict within a character. And in most cases, it's always of a moral nature. A moral nature. A moral nature. A very good example, a story is told of a place in Southern Africa, actually set in Southern Africa. There was a long drought spell and people were dying. So there was an oracle, a seer, it's like a god, that said, for you to end this drought, because people are almost dying, for you to end this drought, you must sacrifice a human being. You must sacrifice a human being. And not just another person, but the most beautiful lady in the community. And so the community came together to chart the way forward. So they said they're going to choose a lady to be sacrificed. Now, that's a conflict. It's not easy for you to allow your child to be sacrificed. At the same time, if that does not happen, the whole community is going to do what? Is going to perish because of the long drought. So imagine if you're a parent of this lady, what would you do? That's a conflict within you, person against self. The third one is conflict, so not conflict, person against community. Person against community. In this case, here is a character and here is the community. The character wants to do something, yet this thing is against the community's expectations or rules or conventions. So that's a conflict. I give a very good, for example, the issue of female genital mutilation. Yes, a person who is fighting against that is called a gender activist. But the community is still so much into that cultural practice. So this person finds himself or herself in conflict with the community. Whereas he wants to eradicate FGM, female genital mutilation, the community is against that. So you find there's going to be a conflict between person and the community. So in this case, a character differs with the opinion and principles, opinion and values. Let me say opinion, values, and cultural norms of a community. So that's person against community. And lastly is person against nature. Against nature. Now we have forces of nature. So we might find a character. For something like floods, that's nature. Okay. So we may find a character who is trying to overcome forces of nature, things like floods, anything that you think is beyond your control. That's nature. So a character trying to fight off the forces of nature, such as the effects of drought in a certain region, in a given region. So this is person against nature. So student, there are 4 types of conflicts. Number 1, I've said person against person. That means person against another person, another character. Person, in this case, person means character against self. Then there's person against community. Then person against nature. When you try to fight those forces of nature that maybe are working against your downfall. So that's conflict. Now we're going to look at another concept now we call plot. Now, plot in literature means the storyline. It means the flow of events, the flow of events or actions from the beginning to the end. That is plot. The flow of event. When a story begins, can you trace, can you follow the major events or actions in that story from the beginning up to the end? That is plot. Now, plot takes some stages. Even before we look at those stages, let me give a very good example of our natural life. We're normally told a child is born. That's the first stage in life. Stage 1, a child is born. Second stage in life is that stage, for example, going to school. That's a major stage in life. The third stage can be initiation into adulthood. That's the third stage in life. The fourth stage will be maybe marriage, for those who want to marry. Okay? Then after that, can have like the working, for those who are working. Then after working, later on in life, when you have become old, you do what? You'll die. So those are the stages in life. We call that the plot of life. We know one day, from the time you are born to the time you die. Those are the stages in life. We call that plot. You can actually even draw a graph. You can draw a graph and say from the time you're born all the way to the time you are very productive in life. Then the way it works. When you are born, you are unproductive. You can draw this graph here. When you are born, you are here. Then you begin growing. As you grow, become more productive. In your prime age, you are here. That's the time in your prime age. That's the time you are working, you are very productive. Then as you begin to age, you begin to go down. This in terms of work output. You can't work. Begin to go down. Finally do what? You stop working. Then you die. This is the beginning point. The point where someone is born. This is the point where someone dies. So this is the plot of life. Here is education. Here is marriage, for example. Here is work. Okay? And then old age begins to set in. Old age begins to set in slowly. And then finally here you are very old. Then you die. So this can be seen as the plot of life. The flow of life. Again, the same can be applied in a story. So I'm going to draw. I'll draw it again. The same concept can be applied in a story. So a story has stages. And we're going to look at those stages. We're going to look at those stages. Stages of a plot line, of a plot. The first stage is called exposition. Or some people call it point of attack. Second position is called rising action. Rising action, or complication. The third stage is called climax. Then the fourth stage is called falling action. Then lastly, we have the resolution. So a story moves through those 5 stages. I'm going to demonstrate these 5 stages. Just like I drew that graph of life. We also have the same graph here in a story. When the story begins, at this point, it's called point of attack, exposition, or point of attack. When the story begins, at the beginning, that's the time we are told more about the story. This is the time we are introduced to characters and the setting of that story. It's called point of attack or exposition. Now, as the story moves on, we are going to have a conflict. Remember I talked about a conflict. You must have a what? A conflict between characters. Okay? So we have rising action here. Rising action, or what we call complication. We must have a conflict between characters for it to move forward. Now this conflict will continue building, will continue mounting. So at this point, mounting in action. I mean, the conflict will keep on growing, okay? It's building. Conflict is building, is growing. Conflict is growing. Up to a point whereby it reaches what we call a climax. Climax. It will build to a point a climax. Now this is the highest point. And after the climax, things now have to be resolved, what called falling action. Now things have to be resolved. At this point, someone has to make a decision. Once things have to be resolved slowly, then you have a resolution here finally, and the story ends. Resolution. Now let me give an example. For example, in a story where you have a child who is kidnapped. That's the story. Child is kidnapped. When the story begins, we are told there's a child who has been kidnapped. Who has been kidnapped. Who has been abducted. Now, parents will begin looking for this child. People begin taking action, now rising action, okay? Begin looking for this child. They will do investigation and maybe find that this child is somewhere, has been held somewhere by some people, by the abductors, kidnappers. They might even communicate with the abductors. They're called kidnappers. Kidnappers or abductors. Even the police might be brought in, can bring the police, and they begin talking to the abductors. At the time you're having rising action. Okay? It will continue mounting, building. Then now the police will decide to go and look for the kidnappers. Go and hunt them down. Physically. They'll go for them. Now at that point where the police go for them, and maybe they find the abductor somewhere in a room, then there's a shootout between the police and the kidnappers. That's the climax of that story. The climax, okay? After that, now, the police, assuming that they killed the kidnappers, that's the falling action. Once the kidnappers have been arrested or killed, now things will cool down. Remember, at this time, action was building. There was a lot of suspense. In fact, at this point, suspense. At this point, there was a lot of suspense. A lot of uneasiness. Okay? But once the abductors have been arrested or gunned down, then things will begin to cool down. That's falling action now. Then eventually, this child will be reconnected with the parents, will be reunited with the parents. Now that's the resolution. And then the story will do what? It will end. So student, this is the what? The normal plot of a story. Exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Now we're going to explain each of these terms here. So I'm going to explain each of these terms. So point of attack. Number one, said exposition. So point of attack. The beginning of a story where characters are introduced and their relationships given. That's the point of attack. Then number two, we said rising action. Rising in action or complication. So you say a conflict is introduced. Okay? This conflict mounts in action. Mounts, mount, it means grows in intensity. That's the complication. Grows in intensity. Okay. The conflict, it then forces the characters, mostly the characters, protagonist, to take action. To take action to solve the problem. That's the rising action. Number 3, climax. The highest point of a problem, of a conflict, where a decision has to be made. Has to be made. There is also heightened action. There is also heightened action and suspense. So that is the climax, and a decision has to be made. And a decision must be made. Must be made. So that's the climax, and then we have falling action. Action. Things begin to slow down. The actions begin to slow down following the decision made at the climax. Then lastly, resolution. Or the problem is solved are either happy with it or not. So that's the resolution. So students, these are the stages that a story will go through. In fact, this applies most in drama. When we'll be doing drama, you'll see what I'm talking about. It applies mostly in drama. The next literary term that we need to look at is dialect. Now, dialect is a simple term that means that your background affects your language. For example, you have had those people from Asia. The way they speak English is not the same way we Kenyans speak English. It's not the same way the Ugandans speak English. It's not the same way the Americans speak English. We call that dialect. It means your region, your background affects how you speak that language. Even here in Kenya, people from Western Kenya speak same English, but there are some different pronunciations. people from Nyanza, Kenya, Central Kenya, Coastal Kenya, Eastern Kenya, Rift Valley, all of us speak English, but our background affects how we pronounce words. We call that dialect. So, the way we pronounce or speak a language, depending or having been affected by our areas, places of origin, places of origin. We call that dialect. I want to look at one last style, actually just two. This flashback and foreshadow. Just two more style. Flashback. Now, the word flashback, as it suggests, flashback. You are looking back. Flash, like a camera. Flash back. So in this case, in a story, you'll find the narrator will bring in past events. Past events. For example, we find a character who is now working, has a family, and then the writer brings back this character's life when he was in primary school or when he was in high school. Now that's a flashback. When you interrupt the flow of the story to bring in a past event that is of consequence to the present event, that is flashback. When the writer of a story interrupts the flow to bring in a past event that has a consequence or a bearing on the present event. That is a flashback. And lastly, the opposite of flashback, you call it a foreshadow. And I'm going to write here. There's foreshadow. Foreshadowing or foreshadow. I've said in flashback, you bring in a past event. But a writer might want to bring into the story a future event. A future event might give you some hints of what is likely to happen in future. That's foreshadow. Like right now, you might find a character who is in high school. Then the writer gives you some hints of this character's life after high school. That is foreshadow. So the writer giving some hints about a character's future. It's like a prophecy. It's like a prophecy. We call that a foreshadow. So student, before we end the lesson, I want to give a recap of what you have learned today. We began by looking at conflict. We said that conflict is actually a disagreement can either be between characters And there are 4 types of conflicts. There is person against person. That means characters disagreeing. There is person against self, whereby you have many voices in your mind that are not agreeing. And then there is person against community, whereby a character disagrees with the views held by a community. Then lastly, there is person against nature, whereby a character is fighting forces of nature. We went further and looked at now the plot, and we said a story moves in 5 stages. The first stage is what we call exposition, or the point of attack. That's the beginning of a story. Then after that, we have a conflict that will arise, what we call rising in action or complication. Then that conflict will continue mounting, building to a point where we have the climax. That's the time a character has to make a decision. Then after the climax, now things will have to slow down. Then a character will finally, then we shall have now the final decision being made here, what we call the resolution. Then we have also talked about dialect, flashback, and finally foreshadowing. So student, up to that point, we shall end today's lesson. Until next time, be blessed. Thank you.